Take a seat.
Another worry for Malaysia is that the fiscal deficit is extremely large. It's close to 5% of GDP, and that is predicated on a $125 oil price. Oil prices collapsed essentially to $50, which means that it's quite easy actually for the fiscal deficit to swell to 7 to 8% of GDP, inviting a possible weakness on the ringgit. And we've seen some weakness in Indonesia as well with what's happening. Bank of Indonesia, for example, having to intervene very heavily over the last few months, essentially losing about 20 billion in reserves, holding up the rupiah up. And despite that, rupiah still weakening 10 to 20%. I think so. That's another issue that may be coming up into our neighborhood, that the pressure is now emerging into markets which matter for Singapore. Just these two countries alone account for 20% of our exchange rate weight, which means the Singapore dollar will weaken. It accounts for 20% of our trade flows. It accounts for 20% of our tourism flows. And therefore, I think some of the banks as well are more exposed on this front. So that could be a worry. I think there are some good points to highlight why we might not be as bad, just to point out some of the positives. I think the first point is that if you look back at the Asian crisis, we did, after all, see interest rates at that time hit 8%, right? 3-month SIBOR, if you look back. Whereas it today is actually below 1%. So yeah, sure, the corporates are having a hard time and suffering quite a lot of pain in terms of refinancing. But as far as individuals and mortgages are concerned, Singapore is actually in a much better position. So I think unless that really dries up, it's actually not that bad. I think the second point is the dramatic fall in oil prices. Singapore being a net oil importer in a large way. There are estimates out there from the MAS, for example, estimating a $10 fall in oil prices lifts growth by about 0.6 percentage points. So that's pretty important. Today we've seen the electricity prices come off quite a bit for the first quarter. I'm sure it'll continue to slide in the rest of 2009. That will help. And I think the third point is the fiscal policy. Actually, Singapore is in a much better position to respond compared to a lot of countries on the fiscal side. And what is luck or timing? The rules in the Constitution now will be changed to allow for the recognition of half of the capital gains earned from reserves. Previously, I think half of interest and dividends were only recognized. It's not clear how much that will make available to the budget. But if you take your calculators and calculate what might be a 10-year reasonable rate of return on the large size of reserves out there, it's not hard to get a figure of 3, 4, 5 billion in that magnitude. And if that goes to the budget, which is going to be unveiled January 22nd, that will be quite a lot of ammunition to do quite a bit. It could, for example, mean a reduction in the corporate income taxes substantially more. I mean, it's 18% now. The government has previously guided it going to 15%. A 2% cut in the corporate income tax will cost the government $1.5 billion. So it's within that means. It could mean a personal income tax cut as well, from 20 to 18 on the top bracket. That will cost $700 million for the government. But basically, just doing these two things alone, is within the means of the government. We know that also Hong Kong has basically moved in its last budget to cut both the personal and the corporate by 1 percentage point in the last budget. So I think something in that direction will help. The government has already, signaled that it may restart some of the 4.7 billion worth of deferred projects, infrastructure projects, and so on. So that will help as well. So I think all in all, it looks bad. It looks like this recession could be a pretty painful start into 2009. I think it is starting to broaden out. But usually, I think Singapore is in a better position than most countries to position itself and basically to prepare itself in terms of the recovery. Maybe I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Andre, especially for the good news at the end. After the rest of the doom and the gloom. I just want to ask the panelists one question each at this point, and then I'll throw it open to the floor. Manu, I don't want you to time the recovery as such, and there will be a recovery, right, at some point.
Yes.
But what is the earliest sign that you would look at? What are the earliest indicators that would signal to you that yes, we're turning around?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally the world is not broken. I mean, there are things that are broken within it, but these can be repaired, like the credit mechanism, so it's not the end of the world. What would I look for? I think it would be qualitative changes rather than quantitative indicators. I'm not going to look at OECD lead indicator or anything like that. I think it will be qualitative decisions made by governments, and I think quantitative easing, globally coordinated quantitative easing, or an agreement to let the IMF basically print money by issuing more SDRs, which is a very easy way to do it. Something like that would signal to me that the right sort of stuff was being done. So I think what we're looking for is, because markets are failing, so you need government intervention to address market failure. And so far that government intervention has not been comprehensive or effective enough. So once you get a sense that more or less policymakers are getting it more or less right, I think that's the bottom.
And you don't think they've got it right?
Not yet.
Hakben, markets, equity markets, tend to start recovering before the economy starts recovering.
Right.
That's a normal pattern. Right? So I think a lot of questions, one of the big questions that investors are asking is how much of the bad news, which is the terrible news that we have, how much of it is already in the price? And, when can we see, we're not going to wait for the economy to start recovering before the equity market. So when can we see the equity market starting to?
Right. I guess that's the $1 million question we're asking ourselves. Oops. I mean, just to put in perspective, we go back to the previous recessions and bear markets and ask how long did the bear markets last then? And when we did manage to get that historical experience, is that basically the average bear market during recessions lasted for about 85 weeks. In fact, the 85-86 recession lasted for 110 weeks. Tech bust was about 91 weeks. Asian crisis about 82 weeks. Where are we today? Well, we're week number 60. So we're not quite there yet. That's one way to look at it. Week number 60. If you believe that we're just heading towards the average, you're talking about market bottom in the second quarter of next year. So that's one way to look at it. A second way is to look at the valuations, the price-to-book valuations. Looking back at these past recessions, if we were to hit the worst that we've ever seen, where would the STI stand today? And the worst the STI has ever hit was actually during the Asian crisis, 0.7 times price to book, where the bank stocks really crashed, for example. We are at about 1650 today. To bring it to that same equivalent today, in today's terms, it would be about 1200 on the STI. So you believe that we are going to be as bad as that, we have about 35% downside from here. So that's another way to look at it. We asked ourselves also what Vikram asked, in terms of the previous recessions, if you had looked at the maximum number of contractions in GDP in the previous recessions, what would be the length of that contraction? So Singapore has never suffered more than 4 negative quarters year on year. 2 recessions, 85, 86, as well as the tech bust, we had 4 negative quarters. Asian crisis, surprisingly, was 3 negative quarters. SARS was actually just 1. What's the worst contraction Singapore has suffered? Minus 6.5%. That was actually during the tech bust in one quarter. My guess is we'll see worse than 6.5 this time. We'll probably see minus 7 to minus 8 if I had to guesstimate what it would be. My guesstimate that it will be probably in the first quarter of next year, seeing the way the numbers are heading. So we will probably see the single worst contraction. But my estimate is still that probably we'll see 4 negative quarters. But sure, maybe we'll see 5 negative quarters. But we find that bear markets do not bottom after the whole recession thing is over. It usually bottoms out in the middle of it. And it usually bottoms out actually in the quarter of the worst contraction. In fact, just past it. So if our call is that it is likely to be more severe in the first quarter, chances are markets might bottom out by the second quarter of next year. That's predicated on this base scenario of a global recession, but not getting much worse than what Manu has described it to be. Will be our call. Of course, we'll be highlighting the kind of scenarios that we just highlighted, that, what are the scenarios that could be the worst case for Singapore to get this down to the pain that we saw, the 1,200 SDI target. And one obvious scenario we highlighted was this destruction in the neighborhood, I think, which we cannot dismiss. If Malaysia and Indonesia does fall into recession and China really sinks deeper, as Manu just highlighted, sure, we might just get there before we get better.
Take a seat.